We've been talking together and we can't fix one date, for sure.
Arno Anderson used to cover the deficits for the Aspen Institute.
And he was the chairman.
And he was the chairman. And he really got tired of having to write checks for an institute. And he went to the city and said, I need to make the meadows larger and be part of the tourist industry, which would then allow the meadows to provide operating income for the Institute and therefore relieve me a little bit of this personal burden. And the city really stonewalled him very well and said, we don't want the traffic. You went into the business of being an educational institution. I think they're organized as a university. And they stonewalled him, and he just flipped. Yeah, the Meadows is the housing for the Aspen Institute's program, so it's really a hotel.
It's a hotel.
Yeah.
But now a hotel with a conference facility of sorts down there, where, in addition to their conference facility at the Pepke building.
I think it's a good idea to distinguish right now, because in the discussions, sometimes the subject came up of the Aspen Meadows. I even have maps of the Aspen Meadows. As a geographic thing, like the meadows, it's an entirely different concept than the Aspen Meadows, but it got confused all the time.
Yes, so the Aspen Institute has across the real meadows. As their office space and then this housing complex. In fact, the first year of the Physics Institute,
We had rooms.
We had some rooms over there, and the building wasn't finished, so we actually used some of that for office space.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah, but then later on, that was the housing for their participants in their seminar programs, and as George was saying, they were losing money.
Yeah.
And
Now, I don't know who was there at the moment when R.O. and Hans Grauemacher cut a deal. Do you know?
Hans Grauemacher.
Hans Grauemacher was a former ski instructor turned real estate agent.
This was
Hans
That-
Sebastian.
Hans Sebastian, yeah.
Hans Sebastian.
No, of
I
Aspen.
understand we all call him Hans Sebastian. But at some point, R.O. said, the city is not going to allow me to operate the way I need to operate. I'm sick and tired of dealing. I'm sick and tired of covering deficits. And he basically sold the property to Hans Grauemacher.
I thought it was Hans Contrup.
Yeah,
Contrup was the
Contrup.
purchaser and Grauemacher was the agent. Is that right?
Oh.
Was the agent, but not.
Okay,
but he-
Can-
Because
Contrup
we
bought it.
always heard
not
of
the proprietor.
Cantrop. We had no dealings
Cantrop
with
took
Grauemacher.
possession.
We didn't have
Okay.
any dealings with anybody, actually. It was just,
That's true. But we had to react to plans
right.
that
Well,
had
that-
houses scattered all over the
Yeah,
track.
that land business was already going on when I became president of the center in 1972. And I have some correspondence, which is very interesting because at that point the Aspen Institute was trying to give the property to the University of Colorado. Denver University was apparently involved at some point. The Given Institute was involved. And it was simply get these comments from the administration over there. There was in fact one person, a mole, so to speak, who provided me with information and about what they were doing. And then it would be informed officially, we're going to donate this land to the University of Colorado. Well, I would write the people at Colorado about what the Physics Center was about and when we needed it, because the idea was that the university could use the facilities here for conferences. And so we try to establish that, well, we're here, we have meetings, conferences, whatever, all summer. And so there's this correspondence back and forth. And finally, in one November, 73 or 4, I got a letter saying that the from the Institute saying that the negotiations with Colorado had been terminated. So you sort of relax. And then all this business about selling the land came up, and then it got really complicated. But George had this very good attitude. He says, we are very small on the scale of things. We're dealing with the big boys. Just keep your heads down, let them fight it out.
Now, somewhere in the midst of this, about at the end of your presidency, I guess, the Physics Center decided to build, we needed a library building, decided to build its second permanent building as opposed to the infamous temporary building, Herbert Hall, ultimately named Bethe Hall in honor of Hans Bethe. Can some of you guys who were around then tell me how we managed to get permission with the ownership of the land up in the air and the city nipping at Anderson's heels about a master plan for the development of the whole thing? Somehow or other we managed to negotiate permission to build a building on land we did not own, a building which, as I recall, we did not own after we paid for it.
Correct.
Right.
Is that right?
I don't know the details about how did the city, because we obviously got a building permit.
Right.
It was not an illegal building.
It was a legal building.
And I don't recall. I don't think I did it.
Oh, I don't recall.
I always thought you did it.
I
Maybe I
thought
did.
Randy probably did it because
I
the
think-
building was ready to start when Paul became president.
Yes.
When
Yes.
Paul Fishbane became
That's
president.
right, but Paul was very active in
Yeah.
getting it done. I mean, he was really
With the town.
the force.
Paul may have been the person who actually dealt
With the city?
with the city, but also there were dealings through the architect with the city, so that
The architect was Jack Walls, who is no longer living in Aspen, but is the guy who designed the building and was the person on the ground making sure it was built right. And I
And-
think also dealing with the Institute and Herbert Bayer.
well, the Institute at that point still hadn't sold the land, so they, whatever their attitude was, they didn't object to our having a permanent building instead of Herbert Hall. So part of the idea in their mind, I think, was that we were replacing Herbert Hall. So,
And Wall designed the building right in tune with the other buildings with a leaky roof.
Well, not quite right in tune, because after the building plans were in place, and perhaps even after we started it, the Institute reared up as usual and said it didn't blend properly with the other Herbert Bayer buildings. So we negotiated,
It didn't leak enough.
no, this was the walls. We negotiated different kind of siding than Walls had originally agreed to, and we managed to get the Institute to actually write a check for slightly more than $10,000 to pay for the changes that they demanded in the exterior of the building.
yeah, it did blend in well, and we grew more trees.
It was the first serious sale, so to speak, of a series of people who thought if they have that, I mean, it's obviously choice land, that they could make something very profitable out of it. But they didn't realize that if you have an SPA, a specially planned area, you've got nothing.
That's right.
Because you need approval for everything, and the city held firm that they are not going to approve anything until there is a master plan, which they approve.
Yes, well, this was part of a long set of zoning problems, because as Peter said, the zoning was not clear as to what you could do. So when we were getting ready to build Bethe Hall, we in fact had a petition in to have this area zoned academic. And, and that apparently went through, at least for this
But during all of
small-
this, the city, I remember almost every year, there was some proposal from the Institute, and the city demanded a master plan. And
Yeah.
they had,
So they can turn
they,
it down.
they stonewalled, as you said, but they refused to let the Institute do almost anything in the way of changes to their buildings until there was a master plan for the whole acreage, which is why I thought it was such a mystery that we managed to build a building here.
Yes, yes.
I think we just slipped under the radar on
Yes.
everybody. It's the same
Well-
thing. They were all frying. They were frying the 80-acre fish.
Yeah. Well, one of the zoning things which they turned down, which involved us, which we were quite happy to have turned down, was a request for variance so we could move Herbert Hall over actually
Yes.
Oh, yes.
past this building and put it right out on,
I remember that because I was appointed to argue for the move in front of the city council. Well, I didn't do a very good job.
oh,
I mean, they said how we had to move the building, and they said no. So I came back to you guys and said, sorry, we can't do it.
oh. we
But
were
they
so-
pointed out something perfectly reasonable, that nothing is up to code in the building, and if we move it, it would cost us. So at that point, we decided Herbert Hall is Herbert Hall until we have a chance to build something permanent, and that makes no sense until we have control of the land.
In the earlier discussion, people talked about the Institute being rather friendly to the Physics Center for a while, and there was some sort of change in their attitude with the Institute really taking the point of view that not only did they own the land, which was clear, but they had a right to the buildings. And I had forgotten, but I found in the files a letter that I wrote to the Institute. They had asked us to let them know every year what we were going to do with the buildings. Well, we thought it was well known what we were going to do with the buildings every year. But there's this letter informing the Institute that, as we have for the past 15 years or something, we intend to continue using our buildings in the summer. And the Institute wrote back and said, thank you very much, but if there's any change, you must let us know, and also let either the University of Denver or University of Colorado, whoever was in the deal at the time. So they continued into the 80s to assert their right to at least oversee what had been our use of the Physics Center campus for 20 years.
But that's
Yeah.
typical. Their language, what are you going to do with our buildings?
Yes.
Yeah.
And we would write back and say, what we're going to do with our buildings.
And there was a time when we went through a discussion with them as to who insured the buildings. Insuring the buildings is a non-trivial cost in our budget, and there was, I don't remember how it worked out, but for a while, I think they paid the insurance so they could assert that right, and then they said, they're your buildings, you have to pay the insurance.
We'll take the depreciation.
Torn between cheapness.
That's right, that's right.
But then, Peter, you were involved, as I recall, in the later negotiations very much.
Yes. Well, let me start there. There was this period, Cantrip, Nothing, Hadid, where there were three big plans for the area. One of the three only Mike and I saw, and that was in the middle in between. A Mr. Fine appeared.
Oh, yes, Mr. Fine.
Do you remember
Yes,
that?
now I remember.
And he said he's going to buy the whole thing. And
And then wasn't he
was
gonna
were
give
you
us the
president
land?
by
And-
then?
Maybe.
Because I remember we took him to the steakhouse, the
Skier chalet?
the skiers' chalet,
Yes.
and had dinner there. And the most amazing thing happened. He had an assistant, and it turned out the assistant had been in Aspen for a while. We thought the whole thing that he just blew in from Minnesota with that idea. It turns out he had this assistant in Aspen for a while, and the assistant rolled out a whole detailed thing on the
Right.
table. I was flabbergasted. I mean, it was like it was a done deal.
But Fine was one of these sort of fast-talking guys. He was not only going to buy this, he had these grand plans.
Yes.
He loved science. He was even going to help fund the Physics Center.
Well, he did fund the thing in Minnesota.
Yes, but he didn't fund anything here, as I recall.
No, but he had.
He was a
I mean,
genuine
we
guy. He
took it-
actually had money.
We took it seriously because he had funded some substantial effort.
I had forgotten about Fine.
Yeah.
Do you
So
think
there was
that you could
Cantrip,
put some
Fine,
dates-
and-
Could you put some dates on the Cantrip, Fine, and Hadid? Could one or the other? of
Let
them?
me say, I started 3 days ago to make a timeline, which by now has one entry. 1988, where we argued with the consortium and the city. And that culminated, that was the culmination in the agreement.
I think
But
that's really, really interesting
that's,
history there.
that's the only date I have down here.
I can almost put a date on it, but I can't be sure of who was doing what when. I became president just before our 25th year of operation, which was in 1986. And I had the bright idea that I would write to Mr. Anderson and explain to him what a wonderful idea it would be if, in recognition of our 25th year of operation, he granted us title to our land. He said no. And I think the reason for saying no was that there was also a discussion I had with him in that period. I clearly remember sitting on the bench in front of the Ben Lee Memorial plaque on that rock, next to Anderson, just like this, and we talked about our need for the land, and he looked me in the eye and said, "You know, it has always been my plan to convey to the Physics Center title to its land. We're just waiting for, because our title is unclear." And I was very enthusiastic about this. Naturally. So I sat down later with Nick McGrath, who was a longtime lawyer for the center, and we went over all the options. And Mr. Anderson had said, write to so-and-so. Who was the secretary of the Institute for so long? I've forgotten the man's name. So Nick put together this 3-part plan. There was a quitclaim deed that would simply allow them to convey the property. I think there was something about a lease, and I couldn't find the document. There was something else. And as he had instructed me, I wrote to the Institute, and they brought it up with the board, and I got a letter back saying, we're not going to do anything at this time.
Yeah,
But so somewhere in the mid to late 80s, I wrote that letter because Anderson had said we can't do anything until we have clear title to our land. And I believe that the final Hadid thing fell through sometime in the period of 85 to 88. And that's what got me and Nick McGrath together and produced this last letter.
it had been my dream that I would be the one under whose presidency we became masters of our
Mine
own
too.
thing.
Mine too.
And sure enough, Merv Goldberger, who is an eminent physicist and was on the board of the Institute, came to me with a message that Anderson had said he would give us the land. So I waited for, for that. And the next year, Milk said, I'm going to the trustees meeting in Aspen, what can I convey? And I said, convey to Anderson, let my people go. and then he would phone me back and he said, yes, I had one car ride with Anderson and I said that, how about the physics? And he said, the only answer he got, it's not convenient right now.
Anderson was always giving us the impression that if we just, at least in the era of the 70s and the 80s, if we just managed to present things to him in the right way, he could really help. And during this conversation on the bench, we talked a lot because there was the threat to develop the property just immediately to the west of the Physics Center with putting some houses and things there. And you will remember that there was a path that ran just about where Smart Hall now is, over to the meadows, to the racetrack, to the old horse track. So there were a lot of people who liked to walk back and forth, and the path was well worn. We kept our dumpsters out here, and we could see the threat of them developing a collection of giant houses right on the meadows, immediately adjacent to us. And I talked to Anderson about this problem, and we were really concerned about getting title to our land. And so he promised to look into that, and as he left the meeting, he got into this small car with whoever was at the meeting with him, and they drove down the walking path right to the edge of the horse track and looked out at the horse track for a minute, and he drove back looking very helpful, and he said, "You've got a problem." And drove away. We just never got any help.
Here again, I would like to, I would be very happy if I had a date. There was around that time, started the process, that is, during my presidency was 83 to 85, and then 85 on. There started the process of planning for this whole area. And that included everything you see, and the horse track. The horse track was, when we moved in, it was a horse track. Vivian Goodenow had her riding operation on the horse track. People would ride from town across for riding lessons or events right here. And she had a rather loud voice. You could hear every command, canter, trot. So it was a horse track.
It goes back farther than that, because on the early maps of Aspen, it shows as a race course.
Yeah.
It was out in the west end of town, right by Castle Creek, and it's a large area which is all sagebrush and has very nice natural setting, flowers and so on, and that just this track around the end. And that was something which the people over at the Meadows complex looked out at, and they liked the view. We're right on the edge of it. We liked the view. Yeah. The city was very conscious of this, wanted that area preserved.
That's right.
And the rest of this area includes physics, and we're on around 2.5 acres at this point. But then there's the Music Associates of Aspen, the big music festival. They have a large chunk of this land. They were in the same land situation as we were. They were on Institute property with their own large tent for concerts, and they wanted to build some new facilities, new buildings. They couldn't do anything without some title to the land. And then you had the Aspen Institute as such, with its buildings and the Meadows housing complex adjacent to it. So it's a very large area. I'm not sure what the acreage is, but it's something which involved 3 different institutions in major ways, plus then the whole Aspen scenic situation.
The open space.
Open space.
I looked through the material the last few days a little bit. It's very confusing, but there are many agencies like the MAA, etc., who put in plans. Everyone horrendous as far as, because people cannot help but look at the track and say, that's for me. That's where the new music tent will go. That's where the housing for the music will go. Everybody wanted a piece of the action,
Or
except
that's simply
us.
where high-end houses will go.
What?
Or high-end houses on the open market.
High-end houses. And here somebody, then came the Blue Ribbon Committee.
Well,
And,
shortly before the Blue Ribbon Committee, while you were president, in, I think it was late '84 or early '85, I remember you and George and I had lunch together downtown Aspen in the patio next to where Pinocchio's used to be.
Yes.
And we discussed
remember.
the problem that, I mean, everybody associated with the Physics Center knew some people in town. And everyone associated with the Physics Center was concerned about the future of our land.
Yes.
So we had a bunch of retail negotiations going on, and we would hear so-and-so would come back to Peter as president and say, I've been talking to so-and-so and I can work this deal out. And George said, look, we've got to speak with one voice.
That's right.
At which point Peter appointed a committee with George, of course, as the chairman.
That's right. Because I was getting the feeling, and I was very uneasy because people came to me with this or that, having made some judgment on the tennis court that we didn't have the right lawyer and I should hire so and so. So I got very uneasy. There were too many loose cannons running around. And so I phoned George. I figured I need a firm big cannon, and I got George.
Yes, and you provided instructions at the Physics Center's members, trustees meetings. Keep your mouths shut.
Yeah, that's
Only
right.
George
You can
is
say
allowed to
anything at the
talk.
meeting, but in town,
It must all go through the campus planning committee, which
the
will
panic,
speak for us.
and that was George. And are we still talking about the track? I think here's something that you probably wrote about the various players in the discussions that started with the Blue Ribbon Committee. And somebody wrote, and of course there's the West End Dog Walking and Jogging Society, which will represent the political activists of the electorate. They want no change and are probably unrealistic in their perception of their actual political power. Now, I felt that I was one of those, actually. I was. I jogged and I dog walked. And I was also president of the center. So I felt I had 2 votes. And considering the possibility, I think nobody that came later than that has any idea how lucky we are if they look around compared to any of 10, 15 plans that were submitted as master plans. The place looks more or less like it used to, which is precisely what we argued for. We were the only ones. I mean, I always argued we want no change. Amending that by saying we want nothing, but that's an active word. We want nothing from everybody else either. In fact, I had to say that to Hadid, who called us in at the beginning of his
Yes.
reign. Now, I called you, you were out of town. I don't know whether you were president then or whether I
I don't
was there,
remember.
but I know that we were the two that had to go to Hadid, who was in a trailer of some sort. He had some office set
In
up.
a trailer somewhere down.
And there was Hadid and his creature Sarpa. You know Sarpa?
Very well.
The trouble with that, with the Blue Ribbon Committee, is that none of us can quite remember exactly how it came about and what it is and when. But there was, before the serious discussions that happened, culminated in '88, there was appointed something called the Blue Ribbon Committee, I guess by the city. And it was chaired by Heller, George Heller. What was Heller's first name?
I don't know. I thought the
Mort
Mark Heller?
Mort.
Mort Heller.
Mort.
That's right, that rings a bell. And I or you appointed Elihu to the committee. He was our representative.
maybe that was you. I don't remember.
And he said, well, everybody else is coming in and they all have a gimmick, like they are shooting for the extra music facility, a big tent on what is now our path to the tent. And the Aspen Meadows wants to tear down the trustee houses, or the Institute wants the Meadows to tear down the trustee houses and build many more houses there, etc. And we are the only ones who have nothing. So we have to invent something. And I came up with a couple of lame things, and then Elihu said, Circle of Serenity.
This is the thought of being left alone.
And that turned out to be a very stable phrase.
Yes.
It means nothing, but it's become an icon.
Yeah,
Of course, these houses there are in our circle of serenity.
And on the racetrack.
What?
And on the racetrack.
On the restaurant.
Yeah.
Well, at the beginning of these, first of all, Mayor Bill Sterling was probably the president of the Dog Walking Society. He was deeply committed as a West Ender to, his dog was a vegetarian. And it was really important for that dog to be able to, and Bill to take that walk. And he loved that walk. So early as these plans started coming out by various people, finally Hadid, Bill and Bob Maynard at the Institute decided this was a political battle that they really had to get into early. And so instead of waiting for a plan to come to City Council, they initiated the consortium discussions. And the ski company funded, actually, the discussions. And Maynard's argument was that this Aspen ski hill is nothing without an intellectual capacity such as the Institute. So he said, to preserve my business, I need to support that there be an institute and a physics center. And the mayor was saying, like, I'm mayor, we can't let the Institute fall in my watch, and then where will I walk my dog? And
Now this was, I think Maynard didn't come until the late 80s, is this
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah,
This would have been
exactly. That's right.
88,
this is
89.
this
something
was
like
in the
that.
fat was in the fire.
Yeah.
Maynard and Bill Sterling wanted to do a preemptive strike to not have a final submission plan by the developer, but to negotiate the outcome of the property before a plan was submitted.
Yes.
And as I recall, the plan was this multi-partite, complicated thing. I believe it was Hadid he was going to build a major hotel, resort hotel at the foot of Aspen Mountain, and a part of the deal was he was going to use some of the open space out here. The Aspen Institute trustees have houses down on the edge of the meadows. They were going to tear those houses down and build more. And this was all somehow coupled, that if he did this major development at the foot of Aspen Mountain, he got some rights out here, but he was also going to preserve some of the space. And
that concept was transferable development rights before it even was named that.
right.
This was very creative.
That was possibly our salvation, actually, the big hotel there.
Yeah.
Because that was much more important financially than Hadid's plans for here. So he was willing to compromise, I would think,
Yes, and he also.
quite
he
a bit
also-
with the city for
he-
rights
he
at the
needed
hotel.
some open space or whatever, because he was greatly increasing the density
Right.
downtown.
He
So
needed
had
the
to-
open space.
He needed it.
But not as much as we wanted.
No.
No,
So it's gotten quite confusing if you don't know what's being talked about.
It's gotten quite confusing even if you do.
Yeah.
Even if you're doing the talking.
Okay, continue.
well, they formed, the property was divided somewhere along the line into two chunks. One was called the campus, which includes the obvious things, and the other, the meadows. Sometimes you hear East Meadows and West Meadows. The track is part of East Meadows. And they have formed something called the consortium as opposed to the onus. The consortium consisted of the Aspen Center for Physics, MAA, IDCA, that's the International Design Conference of Aspen, and the community. Now the community, that's the dog walkers, is an ill-defined, but at the meetings was represented. I don't know how and why somebody had the right to get up and I say, I represent the community, but there it was. The owners were Hadid and the Institute. We didn't really know who owned what exactly, but they were in these discussions designated as the owners. Now, every one of the agents of the consortium wanted something, except us. We wanted the circle of Serenity. But there was even dissension in our ranks, the consortium ranks, because we wanted our land so badly that if that would be agreeable to Hadid, we were willing to make all kinds of compromises, except I, as Elihu put it, was much too cranky about the track because I was a dog walker to make any compromises. And we got away with it, not because of me, but because somehow, by some miracle, even the last 88 plan that I see here in the archives looks horrible. I don't know when did that miracle finally happen that something called the agreement came about, which says that the track is sacred,
I
so
believe
to
this
speak.
is post-88, because I don't remember being a part of that.
What's the date of the deed and the agreement?
It must be 89, no?
That, we didn't encounter in the archives, I don't know.
Well, you do
It's
have
around
a
there.
deed, but
But somewhere in, to confuse things more, somewhere in the mix, there was this issue of a couple of locals doing deed searches discovered that there was a question about the ownership of, it's actually basically the property on which these buildings now sit.
Yeah. Where
What-
you are sitting.
Where you're now sitting. It was formerly, this area I referred to,
it's
the
the extension of the street.
extension
It
of
belonged to
the,
the city.
of Gillespie Street out here. We had been using that, our dumpsters were there, people took walks, the neighbors walked out here. And there's some confusing stuff in the archives. Depositions, claims of open and notorious use over the years, giving us rights to the land. And I simply don't remember what happened, but this also came in the late 80s, at the time that the campus planning committee, Hadid, the Blue Ribbon Committee, all this stuff was going on. Suddenly there's a lawsuit claiming title to the extension of Gillespie Street, which
What
would have
was it
been,
called?
I don't remember. Does anybody remember more of this thing?
Well, there was
Yes.
the history goes back a long way, because the first year of the Physics Center, there was a farm, stable,
Right.
sitting right here, and I remember you're calling up, did I have any pictures of the stable? Establishing that something was actually here, whether it was a coal yard down the street, there was a stable here, etc. And at the time, 1962, every week, the weekly Aspen Times was full of legal notices on settling claims, because there'd been all the old mining claims, plus all the property in town, which when mining collapsed, people moved out, they didn't pay their property taxes. And people would claim land on the basis of paying the back taxes. And that was an element of what was going on here. Here is something which was a piece of land, the street had been vacated or never platted, I don't know which, and that just claimed that, we're gonna claim this. The same way as people had claimed things all over town. We'll pay the back taxes, and we've got it. And then we've got something which is worth multi-millions.
It was work, because on the city maps, it had been dedicated as a city street, and therefore the easement existed to the city, and you can't adversely possess against the crown. And then some people had come and paid taxes on it and claimed it was.
And it's
And at
right
one point-
smack on our campus.
The whole solution to the problem of the metals was to put all the housing right here on the extension of Gillespie Street. Muhammad Hadid had come into town from Washington with a lot of Arab money. And he had apparently promised a bunch of investors back in Washington that he would come out here to Aspen, he would pick up these properties, build a hotel at the base, and he had a big investor base of Arab money.
Savannah Limited Partnership, right?
That was Savannah Limited Partnership, and they opened the office, and they were going to proceed to do this joint development, the hotel and the meadows. But the mayor, and honestly, Bob Maynard gets a lot of credit, said, don't start your plan until we've talked it through. And it was really Robert Harth of MAA, what was his name, Dick F. IDCA?
Wasn't Fritz involved also?
No.
What? Harth?
Harth.
Anderson?
No, they didn't.
You do need to say who Bob Maynard is.
Les Anderson.
Bob Maynard, Les
Les
Anderson.
Anderson. Not-
Bob Maynard was president of the ski company. He had this interest that his ski hill be served by preserving the meadows. It stayed a very small group. The Institute always represented itself with their lawyer. Always. We never saw David McLaughlin. Hadid was always represented by Sarpa, who was a lawyer. Hearth would, every other meeting, we met every week for 2 or 3 hours for literally a year and a half to go through, okay, I got a new plan. I remember at one time, Hadid said, you know what, Gillespie Street is the obvious place for high-end dwellings, and that's how I get my money out. And how about you guys like to move your buildings over above the river, behind Pepke?
Really?
And of course, I don't have a lawyer there. I was the only one who never took a lawyer. And I said, oh, sure, we'd love that. We'd be right over the river. And they said, really, you'd love that? Yeah. I said, if you guys pay for it. And it finally ended up that, you know, staying here was okay, and the Circle of Serenity was the key. It was always, it wasn't the Physics Center, it was the Circle of Serenity. And so it was the magic words, always.
But in the end, after this year and a half, you managed to work something out?
Well, the thing was, how do we get Hadid something that makes him enough money that he doesn't do lawsuits? And the development was going to be down below the meadows on Castle Creek.
Right.
And then he would get his money out of that, and then he would leave us alone. And so it's always about where can he build enough to get his money back that he doesn't make a lawsuit. And finally, and then the city really said, no, you can't take Castle Creek. And they finally ended up with, you know, you can build some condos up Meadows Road from the meadows, and you can have this little section of the racetrack. And they finally said, you know what, after a year and a half, the time value of money is getting in our way. We've got to settle. We can't just keep arguing. I've got the investors' money at stake here. And Hadid basically said, I'll take it.
Yeah.
We'll take the deal and we'll divide the property up. And I sat up there in Hadid's office. I don't know, it was just getting dusk, and SARPA and all that, and they decided it's worth champagne. And they actually stashed it outside on the porch, just big heaps of ice. And we had a little signing where it's all over, boys. And they popped a cork.
Great.
So we got
That's
our
what I
two-
wanted.
And Hadid lost big.
And what year was it?
Yeah.
I don't know what year it was, 90?
That was probably 90 something.
Right around 90.
It must have been at least a year after '88,
About a year and a
which
half.
was the consortium discussion.
Tom Applequist, who became the president then, said it had been settled when he became president, so it was just.
And when did he become president? I think we've got it pinned down to 89.
89.
All we have to do is look up who became president in '89.
Yes.
The final settlement was the Institute got the Meadows and the Pepke and all of their buildings back. The Music Associates got their tent in the area and the building permit for Harris Hall. That was in the deal too.
Okay.
We got our existing area in the Circle of Serenity and the right to add one more building. And then Hadid got what's developed to the west of us, and I think more potential along Meadows Road.
Well, that must be
But he-
when they separated 8th Street and Meadows Road.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, I got agitated the other day because somebody was digging in the ring. The question is, what's the legal status of the racetrack?
The racetrack. I mean, this was an interesting story. The city of Aspen does not have a very good stormwater system. And on a 100-year storm basis, they would need to dump all the stormwater from the streets in someplace not into the river. So the racetrack is now a temporary storage reservoir for the 100-year floodwater in the streets of Aspen. And it's kind of protected in that position. Oh my God.
Well, whether or not everyone ended up happy, we ended up happy. And
Everybody ended up happy
think they
except I
did.
think Hadid.
Hadid.
Yeah.
So the upshot of it is, it was basically a 30-year struggle from '62 until the early
Yes,
90s.
yes.
We finally end up with not only our campus, but the right to build another building on it, and this principle that it's to be surrounded by the Circle of Serenity.
There's some ambiguity about whether you're not sitting in that building right now,
Yeah.
whether there's yet another building.
This is the Herbert Hall replacement building.
Yes.
We tore down Herbert Hall, built this. The question is, could we build another one?
And I think the answer is yes, you
Yes, I
can.
think so.
Now, and what you want to remember is that that floor area ratio, the Institute is incredibly, you want to make a deal with the Institute? They will trade you their lives for that floor area ratio that you have in that existing building.
The ability to put one more building in.
Right, if you transferred that floor area potential to them, they would give you their daughters,
Well,
if they have them.
just to clarify, both the city of Aspen and Pitkin County have extremely strict regulations in place, laws in place governing the fraction of any property that can be covered with a building, the so-called floor area ratio. And once that's, they often won't tell you what it is. It's give us a proposal, we'll look at it and we'll tell you yes or no. But it's very strictly enforced. And so for the Institute to be bumping its head up against its far limit and sitting next door to some guys who have some floor area ratio available, I didn't know that. It's an incredibly strong negotiating point if we had anything we wanted.
Harry Teague told me that. He said, you have something they need.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
When I look back, I mean, I look at it as in a way, a child of mine that I didn't know was going to turn out so well. And it did. I mean, and then I look back and I take a great deal of pride that any of my children came out all right. And I try to analyze, what was it? What was it? I mean, it was certainly a big stroke of luck. Craig was at the Institute. He was friendly to science. He knew the Caudials, and I knew the Caudials, and the Caudials made an arrangement. Because I was telling the Caudials, you know, I love coming out here in the summer, but I need physics. And they said, well, you should talk to the Institute. So that was luck. We talked to Craig, he's interested. Pepke's still around declining. He doesn't really say no. So that was luck. It's just post-Sputnik, and there's a world out here which is saying, my God, we should pay attention to this. You know, and Craig would invite me to all the well, we were doing public understanding of science seminars, and he would invite me to rub shoulders with Harlow Shapley and people like that. And, you know, that funding was a piece of luck. And I look at it, of course, it was all a piece of luck, but it was also a hell of a good idea.
It was a very good
It just was at the right place, at the right time, and a good idea, so that was luck. Why I still claim that this is a middle-aged institution which didn't get old. It retains a youthful vitality that most institutions become rigid. And a couple of the reasons they become rigid is leaving management in place too long and or becoming co-opted by the major figure. The Salk Institute is the Salk Institute because it's Jonas Salk. And I think the things that we did is, like, I terminated my presidency at the end of 10 years. So get out, get somebody younger, get somebody new, keep moving. Don't ever let it stop, because if it stops, it'll get rigid. Well, you know, on a long hike, if you stop, you don't want to get started again. and then the open society, kind of the culture that we began right at the beginning, because we were cramped in there. It was a culture that's, it's not polite to close your office door. And people walking by would just kind of poke in and say, oh, well, hi, what do you do? You know, that was kind of cultural. The brown bag lunch, leave the car for your wife. She's going to go have whatever, and you bring your brown bag lunch and eat out here. And then there was the physical design. I tell the story often that we designed it without phones in the offices. You didn't come here to call home. You came here to talk to another physicist. We had the payphone. We had the one payphone in the back room, and the idea was, if you are going to phone, you're going to wait in line. You'll pay a price. And then there was the one urinal model that, one urinal for 20 people. Well, any architect will tell you that's inadequate, but we insisted. But the idea that when, you'll probably have to stand beside somebody, even to take a pee. And maybe you'll say, oh, by the way, who are you and what do you do? And then the volleyball court. And we actually built this very informal culture that was always moving with younger presidencies. And I look at, those are, A, the luck at the beginning, and B, the sort of culture that.
And George, a key part of the culture is the shared office.
Absolutely.
And certainly in the old days, when you came here, not only was there no guarantee you'd be sharing an office with someone who was working on the same thing you were working on, it was almost guaranteed that you wouldn't.
The opposite,
And the cross-fertilization of ideas, the sort of forced, you sit there and after a while, you're just going to turn around and say, what are you working on so hard? And it was a terribly important innovation, which very few other institutions recognize.
We got the reputation. You got to remember that I've been gone a long time, but what the feeling was that everybody would come here saying, "Oh my God, I spent 9 months with graduate students and committees and coursework, and I didn't get the paper finished, and whew, I can just sit down and work, get the paper finished. The wife's happy; she's not bitching about when was the last vacation we had." Everybody came here thinking, I'm going to be left alone, and I'll get some real work done, and I'll get that paper finished. And what happened instead was new collaborations.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And that was extremely saleable.
Well, actually, a part of it was you weren't going to get the paper typed here anyway, because
Right,
there's only
but
one person that could type. You may as well go home and get it typed.
I remember once when Marcy, sweet Marcy, was our secretary through there, and Hans Bethe was here.
Yes, I remember.
And Marcy came running in, she says, "George, I don't know what to do. Hans wants me to come in and take shorthand, and I can't take shorthand." I said, "Marcy, fake it."